What would you do if the woman you've loved your whole life married you for love but secretly planned to trade you for power? This is not just a story about betrayal. It's about ambition, secrets, and the kind of revenge that doesn't just end a relationship but changes lives forever. Today on Cheating Stories 7, you'll hear how a childhood vow turned into a marriage on the edge of paradise, and how one deadly twist made sure the truth could never be buried. So, buckle up, like this video if you want more shocking, real-life drama, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Now, let's step into the world of She Married Me for Love, then betrayed me for power, but my revenge was deadly. The Vega and Cruz estate stood side by side along a tree-lined boulevard in Buenos Aires, their wrought iron gates catching the morning light like old silver. In this enclave of wealth and influence, legacies weren't just built. They were inherited, polished, and guarded like family heirlooms. The Vegas had carved their fortune in architecture, restoring crumbling relics of the city into living monuments. The Cruzes commanded the import-export trade, their warehouses brimming with treasures from every corner of the world. Between the two families, there was an unspoken bond, cemented by years of business dealings, shared dinners, and whispered gossip over Malbec. From the moment Isabella could walk, she roamed freely between both houses. The Vega gardens often echoed with her laughter as she chased butterflies across manicured lawns, her small feet quick and fearless. Adrian, just 3 months older, followed with a slower, more deliberate pace, his dark eyes always observing. He noticed how sunlight caught in her hair, how her tiny fingers could dismantle a dollhouse in search of imagined treasure. Their mothers, elegant women with precise tastes and overfull calendars, arranged playdates as naturally as they ordered catered lunches. Their fathers, from the shade of broad verandas, would sip wine and exchange stories of business and city politics, occasionally teasing, "Look, the bride and groom of the future." The children never grasped the weight of those words, but they understood each other with a certainty that didn't need explanation. On rainy afternoons, they built forts in the Cruz library, huddled beneath thick blankets, plotting elaborate games against the villainous housekeeper who enforced bedtime with military precision. In summer heat, they would slip away during family gatherings, climbing the great fig tree that grew exactly on the boundary of their two worlds. From the higher branches, Buenos Aires sprawled like a patchwork quilt, the Rio de la Plata glimmering in the distance. Adrian was steady, his thoughts slow and measured before they became words. Isabella was quick to laugh, quick to challenge, forever dreaming beyond the walls around them. Where he saw order and design, she saw opportunity and risk worth taking. Years only deepened their connection. They learned each other's tells, the twitch at the corner of Adrian's mouth when he was holding back a joke, the way Isabella's brows knit when she was scheming something that would inevitably require his help. Arguments never lasted. Reconciliations were a matter of minutes. By the time they turned 10, the thought of a world without the other seemed unthinkable. On Isabella's birthday, after the last guest had gone and the garden was quiet under a hanging moon, Adrian slipped her a small, crookedly wrapped box. Inside lay a silver charm in the shape of a fig leaf. "What's this for?" she asked. "So you'll always have a piece of our tree," he said, his voice casual but his ears burning red. She looped the charm onto a ribbon and tied it around her wrist. "Then you have to promise me something," she said, suddenly serious. "What?" "That no matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, you'll always be my best friend." He didn't hesitate. "I promise." They clasped hands under the shadow of the fig tree, unaware that in the years ahead, those innocent words would be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. For now, in the soft cradle of childhood, it felt like a vow they could never break. Adolescence didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in quietly, then announced itself all at once. One summer, the fig tree's branches no longer seemed low enough. The games they invented began to feel too small for bodies that had learned to take up more space. Adrian's shoulders had broadened, a geometry Isabella hadn't noticed until she handed him a sketchbook, and her knuckles grazed the firm ridge of muscle along his forearm. He muttered a thanks, looked away too quickly. After that, his glances found her more often, never possessive, never careless, just longer than before, as though he was measuring a distance he used to cross without thinking. Isabella discovered that silence could be its own kind of attention. In crowded rooms, she could feel the weight of his eyes across the noise, the subtle tilt of his head that asked without words, "Are you okay?" At family gatherings, he always knew the exact second to pull her away from a dull conversation, the exact joke that would make her release whatever worry she had been holding. When she laughed, he laughed too, a beat late, like he needed her joy's permission before claiming his own. They began testing the edges of what they were. Midnight messages turned into confessions about futures they claimed not to believe in yet. She showed him mood boards of dresses that mixed heritage with rebellion. He showed her a notebook filled with facades, each sketch a love letter to a city that might one day exist if he learned enough. She teased him for putting too many rules into a single building. He teased her for crowding too many colors onto a single sleeve. Beneath the teasing was trust. Beneath the trust was fear. At 15, that fear acquired a voice, hallway whispers at school from people who had known them since crayons and nap time. Are they together? Should they be? It's cute now, but it won't last. Isabella performed nonchalance. Adrian performed indifference. And later, when the day was over and the performances had ended, they would meet under the fig tree and recount the day's small humiliations like two accountants of the heart. He would say, "It doesn't matter." She would answer, "It shouldn't," both knowing it did. The rooftop became their sanctuary. On weekends, Isabella climbed the iron staircase behind the crew's garage, barefoot and invisible, carrying a blanket and a thermos of yerba mate. Adrian would arrive minutes later with a carton of empanadas, balanced like an offering. Beneath them, Buenos Aires pulsed, the calls of vendors, the hum of late traffic, the city's forgiving breath. Up here, time belonged to them. It happened in late spring as the sun folded itself into pinks and ambers and rooftops turned to low fires. She was sketching a dress inspired by the angle of his jaw when the wind caught her hair and dragged it across the page. He reached without thinking, fingers brushing the nape of her neck to free the paper. His hand lingered a fraction too long. She looked up. He looked caught. "What are we doing?" she asked, trying to sound casual despite the tremor beneath the words. "We're eating empanadas on a roof," he said, but his voice faltered on roof, as if the word had become too small to hold the truth. The city moved around them, a neighbor tuning a guitar, a dog barking 3 times before giving up. Isabella set the sketchbook aside. She could draw for years and never capture the way his eyes softened when he wasn't guarding them. "Adri," she said. He made a sound that was part yes, part don't, part please. She kissed him. It was a small kiss, careful enough to be rewritten as a mistake if they needed safety tomorrow. But it wasn't fireworks, it was a fuse. He didn't move at first, surprised or respectful or both, and then he moved all at once, anchoring himself not to her lips but to the fact that this was real. When they parted, they looked at each other like witnesses called to testify about a miracle. "I didn't plan that," she said. "I've been planning not to do that," he admitted, and the words broke something fragile between them. She laughed, covering her mouth with the back of her hand, shocked by how joy could sound like grief. The days that followed were quiet negotiations. They still did homework under the fig tree, but now their knees touched on purpose. They still argued about colors, about the ethics of restoring buildings, but the arguments felt less like defense and more like invitation. They learned where to place a hand when the other had had enough of the world. They learned the difference between keeping a secret and having something private. Not everyone welcomed the shift. Isabella's mother warned her that first loves could become cages. Adrian's father, gentler but firm, urged patience. The world is wide, the future long. Friends were divided, some cheering the inevitable, others certain that inevitability killed magic. Doubt came at night. What if we ruin this? What if we don't try and ruin it anyway? On those nights, they lay at opposite ends of the blanket and watched planes cut thin white lines across the dark until their fears fell asleep. They didn't call it dating. They called it this, a word vague enough to feel safe. But their lives began to shape around it. He walked her home after late rehearsals. She waited outside his building when his studio hours ran long. He began sketching with a looseness that looked like risk. She began editing her designs with a discipline that looked like care. When he sent her a facade drawing with the caption "too much," she replied just enough like you. They were still themselves. He could spend an hour explaining the curve of a staircase. She could spend an hour refusing to let him. She still wore the fig leaf charm, now on a delicate chain above her heart. He kept her first imperfect sketch folded in the pocket of a Sunday coat, as though holiness required a small, ridiculous relic. The ground shifted slowly, quietly. When her teacher praised her portfolio, she thought, I can't wait to tell him. When his project won a prize, he thought, I hope she's the one who says she knew it all along. Love didn't arrive like a storm, it arrived like morning, gradual, tender, and undeniable once you looked up. They didn't speak of forever. They spoke of next, the next show, the next draft, the next rooftop evening when the city would hum the same old song, but they would be new inside it. If there was a vow, it lived in the ordinary, in the shared empanada, the borrowed pencil, the long exhale after a day that had asked too much. It lived in the way they learned to listen for each other's quiet and meet it without noise. Months later, back on the rooftop where the fuse had been lit, Isabella traced the seam of his palm with a fingertip. If this is a mistake, she murmured, it's my favorite one. Adrian gave her the half-smile that always gave him away. Then maybe it isn't a mistake, he said. Maybe it's a plan we just haven't admitted yet. The city hummed below, patient with their slowness, indulgent with their certainty. Somewhere a plane lifted into the bruised blue dark, its lights winking like a promise. They didn't look up. They were already rising. Buenos Aires in autumn was a city in gentle transition. Jacaranda trees trading their purple blaze for bare, elegant branches, while the air carried the warm scent of roasted chestnuts drifting from street vendors. Streets were busier at dusk, golden light catching on the domes and balconies that had witnessed centuries of arrivals, departures, and everything in between. Adrian and Isabella stepped into this season carrying the weight and excitement of new beginnings. Both had just been accepted into prestigious universities, Adrian into the Facultad de Arquitectura, where every lecture hall would open directly into the city's skyline, and Isabella into a renowned fashion institute whose graduates had gone on to dazzle Milan and Paris. Their schedules no longer ran in perfect sync. Mornings belonged to separate bus routes, different campuses, and two distinct worlds of thought. Yet every evening, without fail, they found each other, sometimes on the Vega balcony, sharing tea while the air cooled around them. Other nights in Isabella's cramped dorm kitchen, where bolts of fabric sprawled across every chair like sleeping cats. Adrian thrived on structure. Lectures, drafting sessions, nights bent over scale models built from balsa wood and glue that clung stubbornly to his fingers. Isabella lived in bursts, 3 days of feverish sewing followed by an evening wandering the city for inspiration, camera in hand to catch shadows and textures before they vanished. They learned to fold themselves into each other's rhythms. When her sketches hit a dead end, Adrian would spread them across the floor, asking quiet questions until her hands began to move again. When his architectural lines felt too rigid, she'd suggest a curve, a dash of color, a reminder that buildings, like people, should invite rather than intimidate. Money was tight. Adrian's scholarship covered tuition but little else. Isabella picked up freelance work, altering gowns for boutique clients, styling photo shoots to afford fabrics that seemed to breathe with the story she wanted to tell. They became partners not only in affection but in endurance. Sundays were their escape. Sometimes they wandered through the parks, letting tango music spill into them from old radios. Other days they explored abandoned train stations, where Adrian sketched arches weathered by time while Isabella photographed the way light fractured through cracked windows. In quiet moments, they spoke about the future in fragments. Una casa nostra, our own studio, children someday. Each phrase felt like a brick laid in the blueprint of something neither wanted to rush. But adulthood asked for muscles different from those they'd used in youth. There were nights when deadlines sharpened their voices, when exhaustion left no room for tenderness. Once, after a brutal week, Isabella snapped at Adrian for arriving late. He met her words with silence, his jaw tight. They spent the evening apart only to find themselves under the fig tree past midnight, leaning into each other without needing to apologize. Despite the small fractures their foundation held, friends noticed. At parties, someone inevitably asked, "So, when's the wedding?" Isabella would laugh and answer, "Not yet. We've got things to build first." Adrian would smile, but sometimes the question lingered longer than he'd admit. Graduation loomed, heavy with both promise and pressure. Adrian received an internship offer from a firm that specialized in blending historical restoration with sustainable design, his dream. Isabella's final collection was selected for an international showcase in Madrid. They celebrated the way they always had, a rooftop dinner with wine and paper cups, the city lights scattered below them like spilled jewels. One night, as they lay side by side on the roof, the hum of traffic rising from the streets, Adrian asked quietly, "Do you think we'll ever feel finished?" Isabella turned her head toward him, her smile soft. "I hope not. Finished sounds boring." He laughed, rolling onto his side so their faces were just inches apart. "Then I guess we keep building." Under the patient watch of the city, they agreed marriage could wait. The life they dreamed of would be stronger for the time they spent shaping it first. And for now, building together was more than enough. Santorini greeted them with a light unlike any other. Not just the sun spilling over the caldera, but a purity of brightness that made the whitewashed buildings appear carved from the sky itself. It was the kind of place where shadows seemed to exist only to give the light more meaning. Adrian had chosen the destination with deliberate care, framing it as a celebration of their recent successes. Her collection being accepted for Madrid, his internship with the restoration firm. What he didn't tell her was that, for the past 3 weeks, he had been carrying a small velvet box in his pocket, waiting for the perfect place to open it. They stayed in a cliffside villa in Oia, the terrace framed by bougainvillea and the endless sweep of the Aegean. Mornings were slow and warm, wandering narrow streets paved in volcanic stone, tasting figs from street vendors, letting the air carry the scent of grilled seafood and the salt breath of the sea. Adrian memorized the way the wind teased loose strands of her hair, how she would tilt her head when gazing out over the water, as though she was searching for something unnamed. But there were moments, fleeting, easy to miss when her attention drifted elsewhere. A glance at her phone that lasted a fraction too long, a guarded expression before she tucked it away. She explained it as work updates or messages from friends back home. Adrian accepted the answer, but a quiet unease lodged itself in the back of his mind. On their 4th evening, he set his plan in motion. He told her they had dinner reservations, somewhere with a view. The path wound up to a secluded terrace carved into the cliffside, the kind of place where the horizon felt close enough to touch. A linen-draped table waited, candles flickering against the twilight. Below, the Aegean shifted in colors no photograph could ever truly capture. They spoke of Madrid, of his architectural projects, of a shared dream for a home that might someday have a fig tree in the garden. As the sun began its slow descent, staining the water in gold and crimson, Adrian's pulse quickened. "Isabella," he began, voice steady though his hands were warm with nervous heat. "I've loved you since before I even understood what love meant." Her eyes widened slightly, sensing the shift in the air. "We've built so much together," he continued, reaching for her hand. "And I can't imagine building anything, a life, a dream, a home, without you in it." He rose from his chair, the ring box already open in his palm. The diamond inside was modest yet luminous, framed by engravings of olive branches and waves, symbols from his family's heritage, chosen with the hope they would carry forward into theirs. Her breath caught. The sea seemed to still. "I'm not asking you to give up your dreams," he said softly. "I want to be part of them. Whether it's now or years from now, I'll wait. But if you're ready," he held out the ring, "I want to be your husband." For a heartbeat, Isabella's gaze held his, and in that space, two futures collided. One with him, steady, familiar, built from years of shared roots, and another unspoken, a life that shimmered with ambition, influence, and the pull of someone else who had promised her the world in different terms. She pushed the thought aside like a stone off a cliff. "Yes," she said, the first time a whisper, the second time stronger. "Yes." Relief and joy broke across his face like sunrise over water. He slid the ring onto her finger, the cool metal warming instantly against her skin. She leaned into him, tasting wine and salt on his lips, the sea below roaring as if to witness the moment. Later, back at the villa, they lay on the terrace under a spill of stars. Adrian traced patterns on her hand, the one that now bore his promise. He spoke of wedding ideas, of trips they might take, of the life they would create together. She matched his words with her own, but part of her mind drifted again to the other man, to the dangerous truth she had buried so deep it was almost convincing. Adrian fell asleep with his arm draped over her, his breathing even. Isabella stayed awake, eyes fixed on the horizon where sea met night, the ring glinting in the starlight. To him, it was a promise. To her, it was both a beginning and a tether she wasn't sure she could bear. The brochure called it Catalina Cliffs, but standing there, it felt older than any name, a promontory of pale stone shouldering into the Mediterranean, its terraces carved into the rock like amphitheaters meant for the sea. Adrian had sent her the link half in jest. "Imagine marrying where the water writes your vows for you." She replied within minutes, "Book it." Once their deposit landed, the machinery of a high-profile wedding began turning. A planner from Madrid, precise, tireless, and always immaculately dressed, assembled folders that multiplied like cells. Florals, lighting, permits, transport, contingency plans for winds strong enough to tilt champagne from its flutes. Adrian thrived in the details. He loved the site visits, tape measure in his pocket, conferring with the rigging team about the weight distribution for a lantern canopy, as though he were designing a bridge. He sketched a ceremony arch with curves inspired by Catalan architecture, argued for a runway-style aisle that gave the processional rhythm without feeling like a performance. Soon, the venue staff were calling him the architect with the groom's smile. Isabella moved through the same rooms as if she were directing a scene in a film only she could see. She spoke in color stories and movement, silk that breathed in the salt air. A veil that caught light without begging for it. Dinner courses that felt like a walk along the coast. She spent hours with her dress designer, choosing embroidery that wove together motifs from both families, settling on a palette that shifted from pearl to smoke to the faintest dawn blue. Their calendars fused into one, morning emails, afternoon calls, evenings turning into lists scribbled on napkins at their favorite tapas bar near the cathedral. When they were together, they were formidable, solving problems before the echo of them faded. But when they were apart, the gaps began to show. At first, the gaps were only time. Isabella canceled tastings for last-minute client meetings. She stepped into hallways during site visits, phone pressed tight to her ear, returning with a smile that didn't always reach her eyes. She used words that belonged to the language of ambition, opportunity, exposure, partnership. Adrian believed her. He wanted to believe her. Still, a seam tugged in his mind. At a dinner with the planner and lighting director, Isabella excused herself for 10 minutes, then 15. He tried to focus as programmable dimmers were discussed, mapping shadows to the beat of the music. When she returned, she kissed the top of his head as though to smooth something over and ordered another glass of Albarino. Her hand in his was cool. The other man entered the picture as a rumor, not to Adrian, but to the planner, who had seen enough high-end weddings to recognize patterns. An associate from Barcelona's financial district. Old money with a new appetite. A patron of the arts who attached his name to promising talent like a reef attracting bright fish. He had attended a showcase where Isabella's designs drew eyes. And afterward, invitations to discuss opportunities began to arrive. Invitations turned into meetings. Meetings acquired a rhythm, a private dining room in a hotel that never blinked, a chauffeured car that could find even the narrowest streets, a tone in Isabella's voice that sounded more like a pitch than a conversation. She began using we when speaking about decisions for her brand, and sometimes Adrian couldn't tell which we she meant. When he asked, she called it mentorship. When he pressed, she told him not to worry. "This is the cost of getting into the rooms I need to be in," she said, her fingertips brushing his cheek as if to close the subject. The wedding date pulled them forward like gravity. They returned to Catalina Cliffs for a full walkthrough, the planner mapping her route from the suite where she dressed to the terrace where she'd appear, the florist setting trial arrangements of olive branches and white roses that smelled faintly of rain. Adrian tested the arch's curve against the wind. In Isabella's bag, her phone buzzed like a heart refusing to be ignored. "Do we like the low centerpieces for dinner?" the planner asked. "Low," Isabella said without looking up. "They feel like conversation instead of competition." "Agreed," Adrian answered, relieved to find them speaking as one again. That night, the sea pressing soft against the rocks, they sat on their balcony and practiced their vows aloud for the first time. Adrian's were simple, a promise to be her shelter and her push, to keep the blueprint loose enough for life to redraw it. Isabella's were beautiful but careful. She called him her home, even when home kept changing its address. She vowed to choose him in the mornings because choosing is how love keeps its shape. After midnight, her phone lit again. A message from the businessman, proud of your progress. Coffee tomorrow to finalize. She stared at it too long before typing a reply. Sent it. Turned the phone face down. Watched the moon draw a silver path across the water. In the final week before the wedding, tension began to show in small, almost invisible ways. She rejected 3 versions of the seating chart, as if names on a page could solve an unease that wouldn't name itself. He reworked the lighting plan to hide a structural column that had started to bother him the way a truth does when glimpsed out of the corner of your eye. At the rehearsal dinner, friends told childhood stories, their laughter spilling warmth into the night. Adrian watched her glow in the candlelight and thought, "This is the girl I've known my whole life." Somewhere in the crowd, the businessman's name hovered at the edges of gossip but never surfaced. No one wanted to fracture the illusion this close to joy. Later, when she slipped away for air, he stayed behind, unaware that on the terrace steps, a man in a tailored suit was waiting for her. A man who spoke about timelines, investment, and momentum as though they were all part of the same vow. By morning, the lists would return. The planner would tighten the schedule, the florist would refresh the roses, and Adrian would tuck an unwritten note into his jacket with the promise to fill it after the music. For now, the cliffs stood silent under the moon, holding both the weight of what had been built, and the fault lines no one had yet admitted were there. Morning arrived wrapped in layers of blue sky and sea blending until the horizon disappeared. Catalina Cliffs breathed salt and sunlight, its terraces dressed in white roses and olive branches, as if the land itself had decided to be pure for a single day. Staff moved in soft-soled shoes, carrying glassware that caught the light and sent it scattering across tabletops. A string quartet rehearsed quietly, their bows whispering across the strings. Far below, the Mediterranean rolled and sighed, keeping time. In her suite, Isabella woke to a room deliberately cleared of chaos. Her gown waited on a padded hanger, embroidery mapping 2 family histories into one fabric. Makeup artists spoke in the calm language of ritual: blend, set, breathe. In the mirror, her reflection transformed into the image she had spent months designing, a bride who belonged to this moment. Her phone lay face down on the vanity, a small, dark coin she refused to spend just yet. Across the courtyard, Adrian stood before a tall mirror, tying and retying his bow tie until his best man stepped in. His hands were steady now, his smile easy. After months of constant decisions, he was finally standing inside the quiet center of the day they'd built. He slipped a folded note into his jacket pocket for after the music, scrawled at the top, a promise waiting to be written in full. Guests arrived in a shimmer of silk and tailored linen, family friends, new colleagues, the handful who had known them as children, and the larger crowd who preferred the version of the story that began with success. The planner made final adjustments to the lantern canopy, ensuring its lines matched the imagined stars Adrian had described. Everything sang of competence, precision, and expectation. The ceremony terrace faced the open sea. White rose petals traced the length of the aisle he had sketched months ago, a design that balanced elegance with restraint. The arch rose behind it like a breath taken and released. When the music reached its opening cadence, the doors swung wide and light poured in. Isabella stepped forward, veil weightless, a woman walking through a story that had decided to be true. Adrian felt something inside him shift, not surprise, but recognition. The woman he loved, and the woman the world saw, had merged into one. He kept his gaze locked on her, unblinking, as if the moment would dissolve if he looked away. The officiant spoke of time as a fabric that must be mended together, of love as both shelter and risk. There was laughter where it belonged, a few tears where they couldn't be helped. Then came the vows. Adrian unbuttoned his jacket, took her hands, and spoke as though sharing a blueprint he trusted completely. He promised the kind of bravery that exists in small things, saying I'm sorry first, making tea at midnight, leaving the porch light on in every city they might call home. He promised the kind of steadiness that holds when the wind turns, to fight for her work when she ran out of fight, to hold the line when the world pushed too hard. Isabella listened with a stillness that was not cold but attentive, the way one listens when they know the sound might not come again. Her vows opened like a window. She promised not perfection but choice. She vowed to keep teaching him how to risk, and asked him to keep teaching her how to rest. She spoke of building rooms together, rooms that could weather storms, doors that did not lock from the inside. When she said, I choose you in the morning, and I will keep choosing you even when the weather turns, a murmur moved through the guests like wind through tall grass. But in the third row sat the businessman, still as a shadow. He watched without expression, a man taking inventory. Isabella felt the weight of his gaze and pushed it aside like a memory too dangerous to hold. She tightened her grip on Adrian's hands and he squeezed back, answering a question she had never dared to ask aloud. The rings were exchanged. Applause swelled. A kiss sealed it, not to explain anything, but to confirm what had been promised. For a brief span of minutes, the day achieved its perfect design. Two people, one moment, and a horizon that looked infinite. The reception translated joy into motion. The glass pavilion caught the sunset like a secret it wanted to share slowly, pouring gold across the crystal and polished silver. Courses arrived in a choreography of servers. Friends toasted recklessly, believing in happy endings. Adrian laughed until his eyes watered at his sister's speech. He twirled Isabella beneath the lantern canopy he had fought to include, her veil streaming behind her like the tail of a comet. Yet between dances, the fissures returned. A message buzzed against her palm through the silk of her gown. She didn't check it. Another buzz, longer this time, like a held breath. Slipping into a shadowed corner, she watched the sea turn from gold to deep iron. Adrian found her there, not startled, but elsewhere. You okay? He asked. Overwhelmed, she said, truth wrapped in a safer word. He brushed a curl behind her ear, smiled gently. Come back to our party. The band is about to attempt your mother's favorite song. And for 2 songs, she let the world be simple. Then came the reveal, terrace doors swinging wide to a night strung with lanterns and sparklers held like stars over the cliff's edge. Guests gasped in unison. In the turn of that collective wonder, she caught the businessman's eye. His look carried no awe, only a reminder. Monday. Momentum. Adrian pulled her close for a slow dance that needed no rehearsal. His cheek rested against her temple. I wrote you something, he murmured. For later, she echoed, and in her voice, later sounded both merciful and dangerous. The morning after the wedding, Barcelona lay beneath a sky so clear it seemed painted in glass. From the balcony of their luxury suite, the Mediterranean stretched out in an endless shimmer, the air fragrant with salt and citrus drifting in from the coast. Adrian was already dressed, a crisp linen shirt, tie loose, a restless excitement in his movements. Isabella, still wrapped in a silk robe, sat with one leg tucked beneath her, sipping espresso as the small cup warmed her hands. Her phone lay on the table beside her, screen lighting briefly with a notification from a contact saved under nothing more than an emoji and a single letter. She didn't open it. Instead, she turned the phone face down just as Adrian glanced her way. "My father called," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "But yours, he sent something unexpected." Before she could answer, a knock sounded at the door. The concierge entered with a leather-bound envelope and a long, narrow box. Adrian thanked him, then handed the envelope to her. Inside, on thick cream paper, was a message written in her father's familiar hand. A private helicopter tour of the Barcelona coastline departing this afternoon from the Marina heliport. A gift to my beloved daughter and her new husband, to begin their marriage with the view of the world they deserve. It was signed simply, Father. Adrian's face lit up. "Your dad always knows how to make a gesture." Isabella smiled, though the expression felt tight, practiced. She hadn't told her father about her other plans, a private dinner the following night at a secluded villa, arranged with the man she'd been meeting in secret for months. The helicopter tour would push that meeting back at least a day. She could already imagine the businessman's reaction, measured words, controlled irritation disguised as charm. He wasn't accustomed to waiting. Their last conversation had been a push and pull of promises and warnings, his tone low but firm. Still, refusing the gift was impossible, not with Adrian's excitement unfolding so openly in front of her. By afternoon, they were boarding the sleek black helicopter, the rotor blades slicing the air in rhythmic anticipation. The pilot, calm, confident, his dark aviators hiding any hint of expression, welcomed them aboard. The leather seats smelled faintly of salt and machine oil, the cabin humming with restrained power. As they lifted off, Barcelona revealed itself piece by piece. The Gothic quarter's tangle of history, the spires of La Sagrada Familia rising like an unfinished hymn, the curve of the coastline pulling their gaze toward the horizon. Adrian pointed out landmarks over the roar of the rotors, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. She smiled at his enthusiasm, letting herself be pulled into the moment, though somewhere deep inside, a knot of unease remained. Halfway along the coast, the helicopter banked toward open water. Below them, the sea was a vast sheet of blue silk, scattered with white sails. Adrian leaned closer, voice warm against her ear. This is the kind of beginning I always dreamed of for us," he said. She leaned into his shoulder, forcing the smile to reach her eyes. For that moment, she let the world be only this: light, wind, and the steady weight of his hand around hers. But beneath the hum of the rotors, she was already calculating the hours, the movements, the messages she would have to send later. The horizon ahead was beautiful, but to her, it was also a clock counting down. Night didn't simply fall over Barcelona, it bloomed. From the Marina heliport, the city unfolded into a constellation of warm street lamps and window light, the spires of La Sagrada Familia glowing like molten gold against a sky deep as velvet. The helicopter's rotors thudded steadily above, sending ripples across the dark Mediterranean, where the reflections of the city lights wavered like ink disturbed in water. Adrian sat beside Isabella, the headset softening the roar, his knee brushing lightly against hers. He was still riding the high from their morning flight, eager for the promised night loop the pilot said would be even more spectacular. "You can see all the way to Montjuic from here," he said into the mic, pointing toward the hill crowned with lights. She followed his gesture briefly before her gaze dropped to the glow of her phone. The faint blue light reflected in her eyes, catching in them for only a heartbeat before she tilted the screen away. "Work?" Adrian asked, keeping his voice casual. Just a quick thing," she replied, fingers tapping with controlled urgency. Her tone was calm, but her posture, shoulders angled, chin tucked, spoke of something more guarded than a simple work update. He told himself not to read into it. This was their honeymoon week. Life beyond the celebration still existed, but the sight of her thumb pausing above the send button, the faint crease between her brows, began to seed questions he didn't want to plant. The helicopter banked gently, tilting them toward the coastline. Below, the sea stretched like black glass flecked with the pale pinpricks of fishing boats. Adrian leaned forward to point out Tibidabo, glittering in the distance. Isabella murmured an acknowledgement, slipping the phone into her clutch with a smile too smooth to be entirely real. "You're missing the best part," he teased, his tone light but carrying a thread of something else. "I'm here," she said, and turned to face the view, though her mind seemed to be elsewhere. "Just tying up loose ends." Before he could press, the pilot's voice crackled over the headset. "Hold on, gusts coming in off the bay." The helicopter jolted under the sudden slap of wind. Adrian instinctively reached for her hand, steadying her as the cabin tilted. The city lights swayed with them, their reflections smearing across the water far below. Her phone slipped from her lap and hit the cabin floor with a muted thud. Adrian bent to pick it up, fingers closing around the smooth case. As he handed it back, the screen lit just long enough for him to glimpse a name he didn't recognize and the preview of a message. "We can't keep delaying this. Decide." She took it quickly, a short laugh escaping. "Battery's low," she said, as if that explained everything. The gust subsided and the helicopter steadied, the city settling back into its precise grid of light. Adrian leaned back, outwardly calm, but his thoughts had snagged on one word in that message, decide. It hummed in the back of his mind like a wire under tension. Isabella slid her arm through his. "You okay?" "Yeah," he said smoothly, though the ease in his voice was thinner now. "Just thinking about the future." "So am I," she replied with a faint smile. But in the dim cabin light, each of them knew they were picturing entirely different versions. As the helicopter traced the coastline one last time, the pilot dipped low over the harbor. The water below caught the beams of the searchlights, glinting like scattered shards of obsidian. Adrian tried to lock the image in his mind, the city, the sea, her beside him, while ignoring the quiet shift taking root in his chest. For Isabella, the view was beautiful, but also a countdown. The turbulence that had rattled the cabin was nothing compared to the storm she knew was still ahead. The helicopter was banking gently back toward the city when the wind changed. This time, it wasn't the steady push of a gust. It was a violent, twisting current, a slap from something invisible that sent the cabin lurching sideways. The pilot cursed into the mic, his voice tight with focus. Adrian's shoulder slammed hard against the door frame, the edge of the headset biting into his jaw. Beside him, Isabella gasped, gripping the seat edge so tightly her knuckles whitened, the horizon spinning outside the window. "Hold on!" The pilot barked, but the warning was almost drowned by the shriek of the rotors straining against the sudden gale. The coastline blurred below, black water crashing against jagged rock. The tail swung too wide, too fast. The next heartbeat brought a wall of stone into view, Catalina's Cliffs, rising sheer and merciless from the sea. Impact came not as a single blow, but in a cascade of destruction. The metallic scream of the fuselage grinding against rock, the shatter of plexiglass, the deep, gut-punch thud as the nose slammed into the cliffside. Sparks flew into the night, smoke curling instantly into the cabin. Isabella's head snapped forward, her temple striking the metal frame. Pain flared white-hot, but consciousness clung. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Adrian groan, alive but stunned, slumped awkwardly in his harness. The forward windshield was gone, ripped away, jagged shards still clinging to the edges. The smell of burning fuel thickened by the second. Somewhere deep in the engine, something popped, a sound she didn't need explained. They had seconds. Her fingers scrambled at the harness buckle, slick with something she didn't dare identify. It released with a metallic snap. She turned to Adrian, whose eyes were glassy but tracking her. "Move," she shouted, her voice raw and ragged. She yanked at his harness, metal resisting, before finally giving way with a sharp click. The smoke grew heavier, curling into their lungs. She could hear the hiss of leaking fuel, feeding whatever hungry fire was beginning to take hold. With strength she didn't know she still had, Isabella hooked her arms under his and dragged him toward the jagged tear in the fuselage. Beyond it, the drop was steep, the cliff face illuminated in sickly flashes from the sparks above. She didn't stop to think. There was no time. One step, then another, boots slipping on loose stone until the ground shifted under them into a slope of shale and brush. Behind them, the helicopter groaned like a wounded animal. Then the explosion hit. A wall of heat and pressure roared through the air, throwing them forward. Stones bit into their palms as they hit the ground. The night lit in white orange for a single, blinding heartbeat before snapping back to darkness. They slid further down the slope until a clutch of thorny shrubs caught their weight. Isabella coughed hard, lungs burning from the smoke. She turned to Adrian, his face pale under the soot but breathing. His eyes found hers. You pulled me out," he rasped. She wanted to answer, but all that came was a nod. Above them, a column of smoke twisted into the sky, carrying the acrid scent of metal and something far more human. Below, the slope ended in a sheer drop to the sea. Above, the cliff was too steep to climb, littered with burning debris. They were trapped in a narrow pocket of rock and shadow, the ocean on one side and the advancing fire on the other. Adrian winced, his hand brushing hers. "We have to figure a way up before the fire spreads." She scanned the cliff face. Her phone was somehow still in the torn pocket of her dress, its screen cracked but glowing faintly. No signal. Just her own reflection, soot-streaked, eyes wide. The wind carried both the distant hum of the city and the closer, hungrier sound of the fire chewing its way down the cliff. For the first time since the wedding, Isabella's double life, the ambition, the betrayal, the whispered meetings, felt irrelevant. There was only one truth now. If they didn't find a way out soon, neither of them would see another morning. She reached for his hand, gripping it harder than she meant to. The fire above had quieted to a low, uneasy crackle, but the smoke still drifted downward in thin, toxic ribbons. Somewhere beyond the cliff, waves hissed against the rocks, their rhythm slow and unbothered, a cruel contrast to the urgency pressing in on them. The adrenaline that had carried Isabella through the crash was fading, leaving her limbs heavy, her breath uneven. The night was colder now. Each shift of the wind carried the sting of salt and burnt metal. Adrian lay propped against a slope of jagged stone, his breathing shallow, each inhale sounding like it cost him more than it gave back. Moonlight caught on the streaks of soot across his face, turning him into a figure carved from ash. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, the fabric soaked dark with blood that kept spreading slowly outward. Isabella crouched beside him, fingers numb as she adjusted his position to help him breathe. She had climbed a few steps higher earlier, raising her cracked phone toward the sky in search of a signal. Nothing. They were still cut off, suspended between fire and sea. "Stay with me," she murmured, brushing the hair back from his forehead. Her voice was softer than she intended, not a command, but a plea. His eyes fluttered open at the sound. "I'm here," he rasped, though it sounded less like a promise and more like he was testing the truth of it himself. Something in her chest twisted hard. This was the man who had walked with her from childhood into a shared life, who had stood in front of her just days ago, ring in hand, his voice steady in the Santorini sunset. And now he might die here on this cold strip of stone between a burning wreck and the dark water below. The thought broke something in her. Words pushed up before she could stop them. "Adrian," she said, her voice cracking. "There's something I never told you." He tried to turn his head toward her but winced at the effort. "Now?" "Yes," she said almost to herself, "because if you don't wake up again, I can't let you go without knowing." He watched her through the haze of pain, silent. "I wasn't ready to marry you for love," she said, the confession falling like stones. "I said yes because it made sense, because being with you meant stability, doors opening, people taking me seriously in rooms I couldn't enter alone, and because there was someone else." The wind shifted, carrying the sharp taste of salt into the hollow between them. Adrian's gaze didn't harden, it didn't even narrow. It simply stayed on her steady in a way that felt heavier than anger. "I've been seeing him for months," she continued, her voice trembling. "A businessman, powerful. He promised opportunities, projects, a future built on influence. I thought I could keep it separate, thought it wouldn't touch what we had. But I was lying to you and to myself." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself on. "I told myself I could love you and still want more. But the truth is, I wanted what you could give me and what he could give me. I never stopped to think about what that made me." The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, layered with the sound of the sea and the faint groan of cooling metal above them. "You're honest now," he murmured finally, his voice paper-thin. "That's something." Her eyes blurred with tears. "I'm so sorry, I never meant to." His hand twitched against the stone and she reached for it instinctively. He let her take it, his palm cold but his grip deliberate. "Don't waste it," he said, breath catching. She leaned closer, her own breath shaky. "Waste what?" "This chance," he whispered, and then his eyes rolled back, his hand slipping from hers. "Adrian," panic sharpened her voice. She shook him lightly, then harder. "Stay with me." But the only answer was the steady hiss of the waves. And her own confession, now hanging in the cold night air, unable to be taken back. The first flicker of light came from far below, a thin, wavering beam sweeping across the dark waves. Isabella's head snapped up, hope flaring like a struck match. Voices followed, carried by the wind, distorted by the jagged walls of the cliff. Rescue was near, but not near enough. She turned back to Adrian. His face was ghost pale in the moonlight, lips tinged an unsettling shade of blue. Each breath was shallow, fragile, as though the air might refuse him at any moment. She pressed her palm against his cheek, trying to will her own warmth into him. "They're coming," she whispered, forcing conviction into her voice. "You're going to be fine, just hold on." His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment his gaze focused on her. "Good," he breathed, the word no more than a thread of sound. "They'll get you to a hospital. You'll be okay," she insisted, even though something deep inside her knew she was lying to him and to herself. The heat in his skin was fading too quickly. His hand in hers was weakening, his grip barely there at all. Above them, searchlights swung across the cliff face. The crunch of boots on loose rock echoed closer, a rescuer shouting for them to stay put, that a rope team was on the way. But Isabella knew even the strongest rope couldn't pull him back from the edge he was already slipping toward. "Listen to me," she said urgently, leaning in until her hair fell like a curtain around them. "I told you the worst of me tonight. I don't want that to be the last thing you remember." His gaze found hers again, steady despite the fading light in his eyes. "I remember everything," he murmured, each word labored. "The good more than the bad." Tears welled up and spilled over, hot against the cold wind. "I don't deserve that," she whispered. "Maybe not," he said, voice barely audible, "but I loved you anyway." The searchlights caught them fully now, bathing the scene in harsh, white glare. Voices shouted coordinates. The metallic clink of carabiners cut through the rush of the sea. "You have to hold on," she pleaded, gripping his hand tighter. "Just a little longer, please." He gave her the faintest smile, a shadow of the one she'd known since they were children, the one that had always told her she was safe. "I'm tired," he admitted softly. "Adrian," her voice cracked, splintering around his name. His fingers moved in hers, one last, deliberate squeeze. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm still with you." And then his chest stilled. His eyes, half open, fixed on something beyond her, their warmth gone. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sound of the sea seemed to dull, as though the world itself was holding its breath. By the time the first rescuer reached them, she was cradling him in her lap, rocking gently, as if motion alone could call him back. They tried to pull her away to check her injuries, but she clung to him until her arms trembled from the effort. Only when they eased his body onto the stretcher did her fingers finally let go. The silver band of his wedding ring caught the searchlight, flashing once before disappearing into shadow. She turned her face toward the sea, tears mingling with the salt wind. Someone above called her lucky to be alive, but she felt nothing of the kind. What she felt was unfinished, a story cut mid-sentence. Because Adrian had died still trying to protect her, even from the truth she had laid bare in the dark. And she knew that truth would follow her, heavy as the night itself, into every morning she would face without him. News traveled faster than the rescue team could climb. By the time Isabella reached the top, the terraces of Catalina Cliffs, so recently a place of celebration, had been transformed into a scene of stunned stillness. The white rose arrangement stood like silent witnesses, their petals trembling in the sea wind. Hours ago, those flowers had framed vows and applause. Now they framed absence. Clusters of guests huddled together, their murmurs low, glances darting toward her before sliding away. Champagne glasses sat half full on abandoned tables, condensation dripping like a slow metronome. The music had been silenced long before she arrived. Her mother stepped forward first, arms half lifted, then faltering in midair. "Where's Adrian?" she asked, though the dread in her voice betrayed that she already knew. Isabella opened her mouth, but no words came. The rescue team moved past her, carrying the stretcher. A white sheet covered everything that had once been her husband. Conversations stopped. Someone sobbed openly. Another voice whispered a prayer in Spanish. From across the crowd, Adrian's father stood rigid, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. His gaze locked on Isabella, cool and assessing, as if searching her face for answers that would not be spoken here. His wife leaned into him, her face crumpled by grief, but his eyes never wavered from Isabella. A man in a dark suit, their wedding planner, murmured to her about handling the press, about controlling the narrative. Adrian's sister overheard and snapped, "There is no narrative, my brother is dead." The words cut through the air. Then, as if timed by some cruel instinct, her hidden phone buzzed in her clutch. Not the phone linked to Adrian's life, but the one tied to the man who wasn't her husband. She eased it open just enough to read the message. No more meetings. Too much attention. Good luck. No name, no explanation, just a clean, sharp severing. The words landed harder than she expected, not out of heartbreak, but from the sudden clarity. She was entirely alone. The man she had gambled her marriage for had vanished at the first sign of trouble, and the man she had married lay dead because of a night that should have been their beginning. People began drifting away from her as though grief might be contagious. Even her maid of honor approached cautiously, resting a light hand on Isabella's arm. "You should sit down," she murmured, but her eyes carried pity, not comfort. The local police arrived, asking questions she could barely process about the weather, the flight plan, the moments before the crash. She answered mechanically, aware of the weight in their pauses, the subtle shifts in their gaze. In the distance, the sea's rhythm never changed, unbothered by the human tragedy above. The air smelled of salt and the faint, acrid residue of smoke drifting from the wreckage still clinging to the cliffside. Somewhere behind her, Adrian's friends were making calls, arranging for his body to be moved, their voices firm with the efficiency of necessity. Before midnight, the press arrived. Camera flashes popped against the dark, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. Questions came rapid fire. Was it pilot error, mechanical failure? Do you blame anyone? Will you make a statement? She said nothing. She didn't need to. The looks in the crowd were already forming their own story. In the eyes of many here, she wasn't just the widow. She was the shadow at the edge of the light, a presence that didn't quite belong in their grief. By the time the last guests left, Catalina Cliffs felt hollow. The wind rattled empty chairs. The floral arch leaned slightly toward the sea. Isabella stood alone at the edge, staring into the darkness where the waves met the rocks. The man she had loved or tried to was gone. The man she had used was gone. And all that remained was the weight of what she had done, pressing in from every side, as relentless as the tide. The private jet touched down in Buenos Aires under a sky bruised by dawn, the light thin and cold. But there was nothing private about her return. A wall of cameras waited at the bottom of the steps, their flashes detonating in sharp bursts as soon as Isabella appeared. Microphones lunged forward like weapons, voices colliding in a barrage of questions. "Isabella, what happened that night? Were you arguing with Adrian before the crash? Do you blame the pilot or yourself?" She kept her sunglasses on, though they did little to shield her from the sting of it all. The black dress she wore, a calculated nod to mourning, did nothing to soften the whispers sliding through the crowd. The family's driver pushed through the press, guiding her into the waiting car. Even behind the tinted glass, she couldn't escape the headlines flashing across the reporters' screens. Widow returns alone. Tragedy at Catalina Cliffs. And worse, the speculative ones, secrets behind the perfect wedding. At home, the silence was sharp. Her parents greeted her with polite formality, no embrace, no warmth. Her mother's eyes were clouded with something colder than grief. Her father's tone was clipped, every word measured. "We'll need to discuss the press inquiries," he said, as if this were a business crisis, not the aftermath of her husband's death. The life she had built began to unravel in precise, public increments. Her position at the design firm, secured in part through Adrian's connections, was temporarily suspended pending review, a phrase that tasted like exile. Invitations to galas and fashion events dried up. Messages from so-called friends slowed, then stopped. Late at night, she scrolled through social media, her name trending alongside phrases like gold digger and Catalina widow. A video clip from the wedding reception, her laughing, unaware of the doom that would follow, had been dissected in thousands of comments as evidence of her coldness. The apartment felt smaller each day. She stopped answering the phone, stopped drawing the curtains, stopped leaving for anything but the bare necessities. The man she had gambled for, the one whose influence had tempted her away from Adrian's steady love, had vanished completely. His number disconnected, his existence reduced to a string of unanswered messages in her hidden phone. Weeks blurred into each other, marked only by bills, by letters from lawyers handling Adrian's estate, by the occasional late-night news segment speculating on her role in the tragedy. Sometimes she dreamed of the cliff, the smell of burning fuel, the weight of Adrian's hand in hers. In those dreams, he always looked at her the same way, steady, knowing, and somehow still gentle, even as the sea pulled them both under. But when she woke, there was no gentleness left, only the slow, grinding awareness that she had fallen from a place she could never climb back to. In the end, Isabella Cruz, once a rising name in Buenos Aires fashion, had been reduced to a headline, a cautionary tale whispered over glasses of wine. And for the first time in her life, she could not see a way forward. It was a Thursday morning in Buenos Aires, one of those gray, heavy days when the light never quite arrives. Isabella almost didn't answer the knock at her apartment door. Most visitors these days were journalists hungry for a quote or neighbors carrying more curiosity than sympathy. But the man in the hallway wasn't either. He wore a charcoal suit that fit like discipline, polished shoes, and carried a leather briefcase balanced neatly in his hand. "Senora Cruz," he asked, voice polite but with the precision of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "My name is Esteban Rojas. I'm the executor of your late husband's estate." The words "your late husband" still landed with a strange weight, less from grief now, more from the unresolved knot of guilt lodged deep in her chest. She stepped aside and let him in. They sat at the dining table, its surface cluttered with unopened mail and half-empty coffee cups. Rojas placed a slim folder in front of her, the paper thick and official. "Adrian's will," he said simply. Her pulse quickened. She had avoided thinking about the financial aftermath. Some part of her had assumed, counted on the fact that Adrian would have provided for her. They had been married, after all. Whatever else had existed between them, they had stood together at the altar. She opened the folder. The Spanish was formal, clinical, and devastating. Adrian Viga's estate, properties in Buenos Aires and Mendoza, investments, bank accounts, would not go to his wife. Every cent, every asset would be transferred to the Viga Foundation, a charitable trust funding scholarships and health care for underprivileged children in rural Argentina. Isabella blinked, certain she was misreading. "There must be some mistake." "No, Senora," Rojas replied without hesitation. "This was signed and notarized 2 weeks before your wedding. It's perfectly legal." Her eyes caught on a final paragraph, handwritten in Adrian's familiar, looping script. To my wife, I leave no material wealth, for love was never meant to be a transaction. My hope is that she finds something of greater value than what she sought. The room seemed to tilt around her. She could almost hear his voice in those words, not angry, not spiteful, just certain. This was not the act of a man reacting in the heat of betrayal. It was deliberate, thought through. He had seen her clearly long before the helicopter crash. Rojas cleared his throat gently. I understand this must be difficult. I am here only to ensure the terms are executed. The foundation has already begun its work. Her stomach turned. This wasn't only about money, it was about the message. His final judgment delivered from beyond the grave, carved in ink and law. As Rojas gathered his papers, he slid an envelope toward her. He asked me to give you this personally. Her fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single photograph, Santorini the day of their proposal. She was smiling toward the camera, sunlight catching the diamond ring on her hand. On the back, in Adrian's handwriting, I would have given you everything if you had only wanted me. The air left her lungs. The photograph slipped from her fingers and landed face up on the table, blurring as tears filled her eyes. When Rojas left, the apartment felt colder than before. She sat there for a long time, staring at the picture, the will lying beside it like a verdict set in stone. On one of the foundation's documents, the mission statement stared back at her, hope where there was none. Adrian had found his way to give hope, and in doing so, he had taken all of hers away. Catalina Cliffs looked different now. In the pale winter light, the terraces were bare, stripped of the flowers, music, and laughter that had once made them glow. The sea below was restless, its surface silvered by the low sun, waves gnawing at the black rocks with an unending patience. Isabella stood near the edge, the wind tugging at the hem of her coat. In her hands was a folded piece of white fabric, the wedding veil she had worn on that day. It was no longer pristine. Faint smudges of soot still clung stubbornly to the lace, like ghosts of the fire and smoke. She had found it pressed between unused dresses in the back of her closet, and for reasons she couldn't fully name, she had brought it here. She closed her eyes, and the echoes returned. The applause, the vows, the warmth of Adrian's hand holding hers. In her memory, the sky that day had been impossibly blue, the air almost sweet. Now even the light seemed hesitant to touch her. She stepped closer to the cliff's edge, the same edge she had seen from above as the helicopter spun, the world tilting toward disaster. The wind rose sharply, pulling at the veil. Her fingers tightened around it, not ready to let go, not yet. This was supposed to mean something, she murmured to the empty air. The veil had once been a symbol, purity, promise, a new beginning. But for her, it had also been a mask, hiding ambitions and doubts she had never dared to say aloud. She thought of Adrian's face in those last moments, the way he had squeezed her hand even after knowing the truth. He hadn't cursed her. He hadn't turned away. His revenge had been quiet, deliberate, complete. But in the dark before that reckoning, he had still chosen to protect her. The wind surged again, stronger this time, and she didn't resist. The veil tore free from her hands, twisting upward like a white bird, catching the sunlight in a fleeting shimmer before beginning its slow descent toward the churning water below. She watched it drift, a delicate, weightless thing, until it vanished into the foam. For a long time, she stood there, staring at the place where it had disappeared. There was no rush of relief, no sudden lightness in her chest, only a quiet acknowledgement that she had released the last physical piece of that day. Turning away, she began walking back along the empty terrace. The wind pressed against her back as if urging her forward. Somewhere far behind her, the sea kept working at the stone, breaking it down grain by grain. Catalina Cliffs would forget her eventually, just as it would forget the wedding, the crash, the man she had once promised forever. But she knew she would never forget, and without looking back, she left the edge behind. And that is how a love story built over decades unraveled into betrayal, loss, and a revenge planned from beyond the grave. In the end, she was left with nothing but memories, and the knowledge that the man she betrayed still protected her in his final moments. Betrayal always comes with a price, and sometimes you don't pay it until it's far too late. What would you have done in Adrian's place? Could you forgive, or would you make sure they faced the full cost of their choices? Share your thoughts below. Give this video a thumbs up if it kept you watching. And don't forget to subscribe to Cheating Stories 7 for more stories that will keep you hooked until the very last second.